So what happens when a sacred Amazonian brew, something called the Vine of Souls, leaves the deep forest and lands right in the middle of a bustling city? Well, according to anthropologist Beatriz Labate's fascinating research, it gets completely reinvented. And we're going to dive into exactly how that transformation happens.
And really, that's the big question here, isn't it? You've got this collision of worlds, ancient tradition slamming up against modern therapy. You've got jungle spirituality meeting big city anxiety. We're going to look at how a practice like this adapts not just to survive, but to actually thrive in a completely new, totally different environment.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We'll start with what the Vine of Souls actually is, trace its journey from the forest to the city, and then get into this new urban spirituality that's popped up. After that, we'll look at who these new seekers are and, finally, tackle the big question. What's the future of ayahuasca?
All right, first things first. Before we can really get into how it's being reinvented, we've got to understand what ayahuasca actually is. I mean, the name alone, which comes from the Quechua language, tells you this is serious stuff. The Vine of the Souls. It's a psychoactive brew, right? An infusion made from combining two very specific Amazonian plants. And for centuries, this has been a cornerstone of spiritual and healing practices for, get this, dozens of indigenous groups. So yeah, this is not some new fad. It's a tradition with incredibly deep roots.
So how in the world did this indigenous practice make the jump out of the Amazon? Well, the answer really lies with a handful of pretty charismatic figures who basically built entire religions around the brew. They're the ones who took it from these isolated communities and put it on the national stage.
Let's start with this man, Mestre Ireneo. Back in the 1930s, he was a rubber topper, and he has this incredibly powerful vision of someone he called the Queen of the Forest. And that vision inspired him to create Santo Daime, which was the very first organized religion centered around ayahuasca. And what he built was just quintessentially Brazilian. It's this incredible mix of indigenous shamanism, folk Catholicism, and even African traditions all rolled into one.
And then you have Padrinho Sebastião. You know, if Mestre Ireneo planted the seed, Sebastião was the one who made it grow like a wildfire. In the 1970s, he started a new branch of the faith called CFLRUS, and that was the vehicle that really carried ayahuasca out of the Amazon and straight into Brazil's biggest cities, and from there, it just spread to the rest of the world.
So these are the three main sort of traditional branches that really established ayahuasca use in Brazil. You've got Santo Daime and its offshoot CFLREs, and then there's the União do Vegetal, or UDV. It was founded in 1961, and it has a totally different vibe. It's much more structured, more discreet, almost like an esoteric school. These three groups, they basically created the original template for how you use ayahuasca in a religious setting. Okay, but this is where the story takes a really interesting turn and where Labate's research gets super fascinating. A whole new phenomenon is starting to emerge, and it's happening completely outside of these established churches. These are the so-called neo-ayahuascarios, the new wave of ayahuasca users.
And this chart, wow, it really lays out the fundamental shift perfectly. On one side, you have the traditional religions. They're all about salvation. They've got rigid structures, dogma. But on the other side, these new movements, they're chasing something else entirely: therapy and self-knowledge. For them, ayahuasca is less of a sacred sacrament and more of a tool for personal growth. The goal isn't to save your soul anymore. It's to understand yourself. So to really see what this looks like on the ground, Labate's research zooms in on one specific group that just perfectly captures this whole shift. It's called Caminho do Coração, which means the path of the heart, and it's a group in São Paulo led by a guy named Janderson. And Janderson's story is just, it's the classic playbook for neo-ayahuasquero. This guy was a total seeker, right? He explored everything: yoga, Buddhism, Brazilian traditions like Umbanda. He eventually joined Santo Daime, but, he felt it was too rigid. So he started his own little study group, where he started mixing Daime rituals with all these other practices he'd learned. And yep, eventually he just broke away completely to forge his own independent path. And he put it perfectly himself. He said, "I felt that what was happening to me was too big to fit inside the Daime." Think about that. The experience was just too personal, too big to be contained by someone else's dogma. And that right there, that desire for spiritual freedom, to study on your own terms, that's the engine driving this entire new movement. And here's a snapshot of what that new path looks like in practice. This is not some traditional church ritual. Nope. It's a therapeutic exercise, and its goal is to activate chakras, a concept, borrowed straight from Eastern traditions and then blended with the ayahuasca experience. This is the reinvention happening right before our eyes, a fusion of global spirituality and modern therapy.
Okay, so that's the leader, Janderson. But what about the followers? Who are the actual people getting drawn into these new experimental groups? Well, Labate's research gives us a surprisingly clear picture.
First off, and this might not be what you'd expect, this is not a youth movement at all. Over 83% of the people involved are over 31 years old. The biggest chunk actually is in their late 30s. So we're talking about mature adults, people who are already established in their lives and careers, who are making a very conscious choice to seek something deeper.
And number two, this is a city thing, big time. A whopping 64% of participants come from Sao Paulo, one of the largest megacities on the planet. So let's be clear, this reinvention isn't happening back in the Amazon rainforest where ayahuasca came from. It's happening in the concrete jungle, right in the heart of the metropolis. And the third piece of the puzzle? They're highly educated. 2/3 of them have a university degree. So let's put it all together, right? The typical neo-ayahuasquero isn't some young, impressionable follower. We're talking about an educated, urban, adult demographic that is making a very deliberate, informed choice to find new ways for self-discovery. So this all leads us to the bigger picture, of course, because this evolution, it isn't happening in a nice, neat little vacuum. It's actually creating new tensions and forcing a really important conversation about what sacred even means anymore. See, here's the deal. In Brazil, if you use ayahuasca as part of an established church, you're legally protected. But these new therapeutic groups, they're operating in this messy gray area. They're not religious in the way the law understands it, but they're absolutely not recreational users either. They just don't fit into any of the neat boxes we have, legally or culturally. And that puts them in a really tough spot, this powerful dilemma. On the one hand, they're actively rejecting the old, rigid dogma of the churches, but on the other hand, they are desperate not to be lumped in with simple recreational drug users. They're trying to carve out this whole new legitimate space for therapeutic use, and man, that is a heck of a tightrope to walk.
And so, this leaves us with the huge, unanswered question. As an ancient sacrament morphs into a modern therapeutic tool, who gets to decide where the line is between sacred and profane? Who's the arbiter of what counts as a legitimate spiritual evolution versus just consumption? Labate's research doesn't give us any easy answers, but it perfectly frames the debate that is absolutely going to define the future of ayahuasca.